"You will pay what you owe, or we will take this house." That was the line that echoed in my mind. It wasn't the first threat, not by a long shot, but it was the one that solidified my resolve. It was delivered with the kind of venomous certainty only a true believer can muster, a self-appointed queen decreeing a peasant's fate from her plastic throne. Her name was Brenda, and she was the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. And I, apparently, was her newest subject. I had come to this place seeking silence. My wife, Eleanor, had passed away 6 months prior, and the city we'd called home for 30 years suddenly felt like a ghost, her memory tied to every street corner, every cafe, every park bench. The silence in our apartment was the loudest thing I'd ever heard. So I ran. I ran back to the only other place that ever felt like home, my grandfather's house. It wasn't in Willow Creek Estates. It was simply at the end of Willow Creek Drive. A 2-acre island of aging oak trees and uncut grass in a sea of perfectly manicured, beige-colored conformity. The house itself was a testament to my grandfather's stubbornness, a 2-story craftsman he'd built with his own hands long before the surrounding farmland was sold off and subdivided into a suburban labyrinth. The fieldstone chimney was leaning just a bit, the porch swing groaned a familiar tune in the breeze, and the paint was peeling like a sunburned tourist. To me, it was perfect. It was real. My profession is civil engineering, with a specialty in land surveying. For 40 years, I've dealt in absolutes, property lines, setbacks, elevations, and the unyielding language of legal deeds. I understand boundaries. They are the silent, invisible fences that allow society to function. My life, however, had lost all its boundaries. Grief was a fog with no edges. I hoped that fixing my grandfather's house, a project with clear, definable tasks, would help me rebuild my own. I hadn't even been there a full week when I met Brenda. I was on a ladder, scraping away decades of chipped white paint from a window frame, when a shadow fell over me. I looked down to see a woman who seemed to be constructed entirely of sharp angles and disapproval. She wore a visor, pastel-colored athletic wear that looked like it had never seen a bead of sweat, and she held a clipboard like a scepter. "You must be the new owner," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was thin and brittle, like old paper. "Just the owner," I replied, climbing down the ladder. "Arthur Graham," I offered a hand, which she ignored completely. "Brenda Miller. I'm the president of the HOA," she gestured vaguely at the surrounding houses. "We have some concerns." "We?" I glanced around. We were alone. "The association," she clarified, tapping her clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "Firstly, this color," she pointed at the patch of exposed cedar I had just scraped clean. "It's not on the approved palette. All exterior colors must be submitted to the Architectural Review Committee." I blinked. "It's wood. The color is wood." "An unapproved color," she snapped. "Secondly, the general state of the property. The lawn is non-compliant with height regulations, and that," she aimed a finger at my grandfather's old Ford F-150, a proud, rust-spotted beast, "is a commercial vehicle. It cannot be parked in view of the street." I almost laughed. The truck hadn't run in 10 years. It was more of a monument than a vehicle. "Ma'am, with all due respect, I think there's been a misunderstanding. This property isn't part of your association." A strange, predatory smile touched her lips. "Oh, I think you'll find it is. All properties in Willow Creek Estates are. I'll have the welcome packet and a copy of the covenant sent over. It will include the fee schedule. You're quite a bit behind on your dues." She turned on her heel and marched away, leaving me standing there by my ladder, covered in paint chips and bewilderment. It was the opening salvo in a war I didn't even know I was supposed to be fighting. I had come here for peace, but it seemed I had stumbled into someone else's petty kingdom. I dismissed it as the ramblings of a bored woman with too much time on her hands. That was my first mistake. Underestimating Brenda was like underestimating rising water. It seems harmless at first, until you're drowning in it. The welcome packet arrived a few days later, delivered not by mail but stabbed onto the old iron spike my grandfather used for messages next to his door. It was a thick manila envelope, and its contents felt less like a welcome and more like a declaration of war. Inside was a 300-page binder detailing the covenants, conditions, and restrictions of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. I read through rules about the acceptable shades of beige for mailboxes, the mandated species of decorative shrubbery, and the prohibition of wind chimes that produced atonal or disruptive frequencies. It was a masterpiece of micromanagement, a constitution for a nation of Karens. Tucked into the front pocket was an invoice. My hands, calloused from years of work, felt a slight tremor as I read it. The invoice claimed I owed 5 years of back dues, plus late fees, interest, and non-compliance penalties related to the lawn, the truck, and the unapproved exterior siding. The grand total was a staggering $12,450. It was absurd. It was extortion wrapped in the polite letterhead of a neighborhood association. My first instinct, the engineer's instinct, was to solve the problem with logic and data. I sat down and wrote a polite, concise letter. I explained that my property was never part of the Willow Creek Estates subdivision. I pointed out that my deed, a copy of which I had from the closing, made no mention of any HOA or restrictive covenants. I ended the letter by stating, clearly and without malice, that I would not be paying the invoice and considered the matter closed. I mailed it via certified post, a creature of habit and documentation. The response came a week later. It was a letter from the HOA's legal counsel. The tone had shifted from passively aggressive to overtly hostile. The lawyer, a man whose name sounded like a caricature from a legal thriller, informed me that my unsubstantiated claims were noted and dismissed. He stated that the HOA's jurisdiction extended to all properties accessed via its maintained roadways, and my refusal to pay would result in further legal action, including the placement of a lien on my property. The fines began to arrive weekly. A $50 ticket for visible weeds in driveway cracks, a $100 penalty for failure to store refuse receptacle out of public view, another $75 for the unapproved rustic aesthetic of my mailbox, which was the same one my grandfather had installed in 1968. Each notice was a paper cut, a small annoyance designed to wear me down. Brenda's harassment became more personal. She would park her golf cart, the unofficial chariot of the HOA tyrant, at the edge of my property line and just stare. Sometimes she'd take pictures with her phone. She spoke to the neighbors, and soon the friendly waves I'd received in my first week stopped. I was now the neighborhood pariah, the man who refused to play by the rules. The isolation didn't bother me. I had sought solitude, after all, but the injustice of it began to curdle in my stomach like spoiled milk. I tried reasoning with her one more time. I saw her making her rounds and walked out to the edge of my lawn. "Brenda," I started, holding up the latest fine notice. "This has to stop. You have no legal authority here." She looked at me with an expression of profound pity, the kind a zookeeper might give a particularly stupid monkey. "Mr. Graham, you seem to think the rules don't apply to you. That's a very dangerous way to think. This community has standards. We protect our property values. Your project," she said the word with a sneer, gesturing to my half-scraped house, "is a threat to those values. You will comply, or you will be made to comply." The condescension was a physical thing, an oily film in the air between us. My patience, a reservoir I had always considered deep, was beginning to show cracks in its foundation. "This isn't about property values," I said, my voice low. "This is about power. Your power." Her eyes narrowed. "You have 1 week to submit a payment plan for your outstanding balance. After that, our lawyer will be proceeding with the lien. Have a lovely day." She drove off in her silent electric cart, a petty dictator leaving a conquered province. That was when I knew that logic and reason were useless. I was dealing with a zealot. You can't reason with faith, and Brenda's faith was in her own absolute authority. The letters kept coming, the fines mounting. The total on the invoices climbed from $12,000 to $20,000, then $30,000. They were manufacturing violations, fining me for the very existence of my grandfather's legacy. The turning point, the moment the quiet, grieving man who just wanted to be left alone died and was replaced by a cold, methodical strategist, came on a Tuesday morning. It was a thick envelope, again from the HOA's lawyer. It wasn't another fine. It was a formal notice of intent to foreclose. Attached was a new, itemized bill. They had gone back not 5 years, but 20, the entire lifespan of the HOA. They charged me the maximum allowable dues for every single month, compounded interest, and a litany of special assessment fees for projects I had never benefited from, like the community pool and the resurfacing of the tennis courts. The total at the bottom of the page was $207,000, $312.41. $200,000. They were trying to steal my home. They were trying to erase the last physical piece of my family, the sanctuary I had run to, using a stack of paper and a mountain of arrogance. I stood in my kitchen, the letter trembling in my hand, and looked out the window at my grandfather's leaning chimney. He had fought in a war. He had built this house from nothing. He had been a man who stood his ground. A cold calm washed over me, extinguishing the hot rage. The grief that had clouded my mind for months suddenly receded, replaced by crystalline clarity. Brenda had made a critical error. She had pushed a man who spent his entire life defining boundaries far past his own. She had declared war on a surveyor, a man whose entire profession was based on uncovering the truth buried under layers of dirt and time. I folded the letter neatly and placed it on the counter. The time for polite letters was over. It was time to go to the archives. It was time to dig. I was going to unearth the truth and bury her with it. My project was no longer about scraping paint and fixing a porch. My new project was the complete and total demolition of Brenda Miller's little empire. And I was going to enjoy every minute of it. The county records office was my sanctuary. It smelled of old paper, binding glue, and the slow, patient decay of history. To most, it was a dusty, boring place. To a surveyor, it was a treasure chest. Every property, every transaction, every dispute leaves a paper trail, and I was about to become a bloodhound. I started with my own property. I pulled the original deed, signed by my great-grandfather in 1947 when he bought the 50-acre farm. I traced the chain of title forward, through the sale of the surrounding 48 acres in the late 1990s to a developer, Willow Creek Homes, LLC. The key document was the one where my grandfather officially subdivided his remaining 2 acres from the larger parcel being sold. It was called a deed of severance. I found it in a thick, leather-bound book from 1998. My grandfather, a man who trusted developers about as far as he could throw them, had hired the best surveyor in the county. The legal description of his 2-acre parcel was ironclad, referencing state plane coordinates and concrete monuments set at every corner. I knew those monuments. I'd helped him set one as a boy. It was a 3-foot iron rod buried near the old oak tree. Brenda's manicured petunias were probably planted right on top of it. The most important part was what the deed didn't say. There was no mention of any future association, no subjection to covenants yet to be written. His property was legally severed, a sovereign island, before the first shovel of dirt was turned for Willow Creek Estates. Next, I hunted for the founding documents of the HOA itself. I found the master plat map for the subdivision, filed in 1999. It was a huge, sprawling document showing every lot, every road, every drainage easement. And there, right in the middle of it, was a perfect rectangle with the words parcel excluded. N. F. Graham, N. F. for Nathan Franklin. My grandfather. It was the smoking gun. The very map that created their community explicitly, undeniably, excluded my home. It was like finding a copy of the Constitution that said, "Oh, by the way, none of this applies to Arthur Graham's house." Brenda wasn't just wrong, she was spectacularly, foundationally wrong. Her entire claim was built on a sinkhole. I spent hours making high-resolution digital copies of every document, the original farm deed, the severance deed, the master plat map. I felt the old professional thrill, the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle snapping into place. But I wasn't done. Brenda's aggression felt like more than just a power trip. That $200,000 number felt personal, predatory. I decided to dig into the HOA's finances. Corporate filings were public record. I looked up the Willow Creek Estates HOA. Brenda Miller, President. Frank Peterson, Vice President. And a treasurer named George Maxwell. I noted the names. I then started pulling the HOA's annual reports and tax filings. They were thin, providing only top-line numbers. Revenue, expenses, assets. Nothing detailed. But I noticed something odd. Their reported legal expenses for the past 5 years were astronomical. Far more than a quiet suburban HOA should ever need. It was a flag, bright red and flapping in the wind. What could they be spending so much on? I had a hunch. I cross-referenced the law firm on the threatening letters with other public records. It turned out the firm specialized in aggressive debt collection and foreclosures. They weren't just the HOA's general counsel, they were hired guns. And their fee structure was likely based on a percentage of what they collected. This wasn't just about control, it was a business model. A predatory one. My investigation took me online. The HOA had a public-facing website, full of cheerful photos of community barbecues and perfectly trimmed hedges. There was a password-protected section for residents. I didn't need to get in. I just needed to see what they presented to the world. The board of directors page had a smiling, airbrushed photo of Brenda. Her bio was filled with puffed-up phrases like, guardian of community values, and, committed to fiscal responsibility. The irony was so thick I could have paved a road with it. I needed more than just property records. I needed to understand the human landscape of my battlefield. I started taking walks in the evening, timing them for when people were coming home from work, watering their non-compliant petunias, or walking their leash-to-regulation-length dogs. I stopped trying to be invisible. I made eye contact. I offered a simple, non-threatening hello. Most people hurried past, avoiding me like I was contagious. But a few, a brave few, would offer a hesitant nod in return. One evening, an older gentleman was struggling with a heavy bag of mulch. I walked over and helped him carry it into his garage. His name was David. He'd lived here since the houses were first built. Once he realized I wasn't going to serve him with a subpoena, he started to talk. "Heard Brenda's been giving you a hard time," he said, wiping his brow. "You could say that," I replied dryly. "She's a piece of work," he sighed. "Wasn't always this bad. When her husband left her a few years back, something changed. The HOA became her whole life. Her kingdom. We all just keep our heads down. It's easier than fighting. She fined my wife $60 last month because our welcome mat was, and I quote, excessively whimsical." The conversation was a small breakthrough. I learned that the community wasn't a monolith of Brenda supporters. It was a population living under an occupation, too tired or too intimidated to fight back. They were my potential allies, even if they didn't know it yet. The final piece of my initial investigation fell into place by accident. I had installed a few discreet security cameras around my property. Not because I was paranoid, but because I believe in documentation. One camera covered my driveway and the street in front of my house. I was reviewing the footage one night, looking for evidence of Brenda's drive-by glares, when I saw something else. The HOA had a contract with a landscaping company. Their bright green truck was a common sight. But my camera caught the foreman, a guy I'd seen around, doing something strange. He pulled up to the curb late one night, long after his crew was gone. He got out, walked over to the manicured median at the entrance to the subdivision, and dug up a half-dozen expensive-looking rose bushes. He loaded them into his truck and drove off. 2 days later, the HOA's monthly newsletter, a smug little publication Brenda wrote herself, was left on my doorstep. In her President's Corner, she lamented the sad and mysterious loss of our beautiful prize-winning roses, and announced a special emergency assessment of $20 per household to replace them. I rewatched the video. I zoomed in on the logo on the truck. Miller Landscaping. A quick search of state business records confirmed my suspicion. The owner and sole proprietor of Miller Landscaping was Brenda Miller. She was paying her own company with HOA funds, and now she was charging residents to replace plants she had her own foreman steal, probably to be replanted at another client's property. This was it. This was the weakness I was looking for. This went beyond harassment and wrongful liens. This was fraud. Embezzlement. It was a criminal act hiding in plain sight. I now had 2 pillars for my case. The first was the legal, indisputable fact of my property's exemption. That would save my house. The second was the evidence of her corruption. That would destroy her kingdom. My grief for Eleanor had been a heavy, shapeless weight. But this was different. This was a problem with angles, with evidence, with a clear objective. Formulating the plan, I felt a part of my old self returning. The engineer. The problem solver. I laid out all my documents on my grandfather's old dining table. The maps, the deeds, the screenshots of her business filings, the video file of the rose bush theft. It looked like a command center for a coming battle. The plan I devised was not just about defense. A simple lawsuit would have cleared my name, but it would have left her in power, free to terrorize the next person who crossed her. No, this had to be more elegant. It had to be poetic justice, delivered with the precision of a surveyor setting a final monument. My plan had 3 phases. Phase 1, the bait. Phase 2, the reveal. Phase 3, the annihilation. I was about to set a trap, and the bait would be Brenda's own arrogance. Phase 1 began with a letter. But this time, it wasn't a polite request. It was a formal cease and desist, drafted with the help of an old friend of mine from college who was now a ruthless corporate lawyer. The letter was a masterpiece of legal threat. It stated that I had incontrovertible proof that my property was not, and had never been, subject to the authority of the Willow Creek Estates HOA. It cited, by document number and filing date, the specific deeds and plat maps I had uncovered, but it did not include copies. This was crucial. I wanted to give her the information but withhold the proof. I wanted her to know that I had found something, but her ego would, I hoped, lead her to believe I was bluffing. The letter went on to demand the immediate withdrawal of the foreclosure notice and the expungement of all fines. It concluded by stating that if the harassment did not cease within 10 business days, I would be filing a civil suit for damages, including slander of title and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And, as a final flourish, it mentioned that I had uncovered significant financial irregularities in the HOA's management that I was prepared to refer to the State Attorney General's office. I sent it not just to Brenda, but to every listed board member and to their law firm. I wanted to rattle the whole cage, not just the alpha monkey. The 10 days that followed were eerily quiet. No new fines appeared. Brenda's golf cart was conspicuously absent from my property line. For a moment, a foolish, hopeful part of me wondered if it had worked. Maybe the threat alone was enough. But I knew better. A creature like Brenda doesn't retreat. She regroups. She looks for a bigger weapon. The trap was set. Now, I just had to wait for the quarry to step in it. While I waited, I prepared for phase 2. I started talking to more neighbors. I didn't mention my legal battle directly. Instead, I asked about their own experiences. I'd catch David while he was gardening and ask, "Hey, did you ever get that whimsical welcome mat issue sorted out?" I'd see a young couple struggling with a stroller and ask if they were the ones fined for their child's unapproved sidewalk chalk art. Each conversation was a small act of rebellion, chipping away at the foundation of fear Brenda had built. I learned of dozens of petty, vindictive fines. I heard about how Brenda had forced a family to resod their entire lawn because she didn't like the shade of green. I heard how she had tried to ban basketball hoops because she found the sound of children playing disruptive. I was building a silent coalition of the fed up. I also paid a visit to the treasurer, George Maxwell. I found his address in the HOA directory and drove over one evening. He lived in one of the smaller, more modest homes at the back of the development. He answered the door with a nervous, twitchy energy, like a squirrel who'd misplaced his nuts. "Mr. Maxwell," I said calmly. "My name is Arthur Graham. I believe you received a copy of a letter from my attorney." His eyes darted around as if Brenda might be hiding in his azaleas. Yes. I'm not supposed to talk about board matters. I'm not here to talk about board matters, George. I'm here to talk about your personal liability that got his attention. I have evidence of significant financial misconduct within the HOA. As treasurer, you know that makes you legally culpable, whether you were actively involved or not. It's called dereliction of duty. I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. I wasn't threatening him, not really. I was offering him a lifeline. I just want you to think about that, George. When this all comes out, people are going to look for someone to blame. Brenda is going to throw you under the bus to save herself. I'm giving you a chance to get on the right side of this before that happens. I didn't press him further. I just planted the seed. I knew he was the weak link. His fear of Brenda was great, but his fear of prison and financial ruin would be greater. The 10-day deadline passed. On the 11th day, the response came. It was exactly what I had hoped for. It was an official notice, posted on the community bulletin board and slipped under my door. Special Emergency Community Meeting, the headline screamed in an aggressive, bold font. Topic: addressing baseless allegations and enforcing community covenants against non-compliant property owner, 912 Willow Creek Drive. She had taken the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. She wasn't just dismissing my claims, she was turning them into a public spectacle. She was going to try and humiliate me in front of the entire neighborhood, to make an example of me. She had no idea that I was the one who had just set the stage. The meeting was in 3 days. Phase 2 was about to begin. The community clubhouse was packed. It seemed every resident of Willow Creek Estates had turned out for the show. The air was thick with a mixture of cheap air freshener, simmering resentment, and morbid curiosity. I saw David give me a subtle nod from the back row. George Maxwell, the treasurer, was sitting at the front table with the other board members, looking pale and sweating profusely under the fluorescent lights. And then there was Brenda. She sat in the center of the table like a queen holding court, radiating an aura of smug satisfaction. She was dressed in a severe-looking pantsuit, her clipboard and gavel placed neatly in front of her. This was her arena. She thought she was the gladiator. She didn't realize she was the Christian about to be introduced to the lions. I had arrived early and set up a small projector and screen to the side of the room. When Brenda saw it, she'd scowled. "What is this?" "Just a small presentation," I'd said cheerfully. To help clarify my position, she had allowed it, probably assuming it would only add to my public humiliation. The meeting began with Brenda banging her gavel, a sound far too loud for the small room. "This emergency meeting has been called to address a serious threat to the integrity of our community," she began, her voice ringing with rehearsed drama. She didn't use my name at first, referring to me only as a certain property owner who had refused to abide by the same rules that all of you follow. She went on a 10-minute tirade, painting me as a freeloader, a troublemaker, a blight on their suburban paradise. She detailed my violations, the peeling paint, the ancient truck, the defiant mailbox. She held up a copy of my $200,000 invoice. "This individual not only refuses to pay his fair share," she declared, her voice rising, "but he has responded with threats. He has made baseless, slanderous accusations against your board, against me personally. He wants to enjoy the benefits of our beautiful community, our high property values, our safe streets, without contributing a single dime." A few of her cronies in the front row nodded enthusiastically. Most of the room, however, remained silent, their expressions unreadable. "But we will not be intimidated," Brenda concluded, her eyes locking onto mine. "The lien has been filed. The foreclosure proceedings have begun. This is what happens when you defy the will of the community." She sat down to a smattering of polite applause. "Thank you, Brenda," I said, standing up and walking to my projector. "That was very theatrical. Now, if I may, I'd like to present a few facts." I clicked the remote. The first image that appeared on the screen was a high-resolution scan of the 1999 master plat map for Willow Creek Estates. I used a laser pointer to circle the large, clearly defined rectangle in the middle of the development. "This," I said, my voice calm and steady, "is the official, county-filed map that legally created this subdivision and this HOA. And this," I moved the red dot to the text inside the rectangle, "is my property. As you can all clearly see, it says, parcel excluded." A murmur went through the crowd. I saw people leaning forward, squinting at the screen. Brenda's face, for the first time, lost its smugness. A flicker of confusion appeared. That's not the official map," she stammered. "Oh, but it is, Brenda," I said, clicking to the next slide, which showed the county clerk's official stamp and filing date. I pulled it myself from the county archives. "This document, the very foundation of your authority, explicitly states that my property is not, and has never been, part of your association. You have no more legal jurisdiction over my home than you do over the moon." I let that sink in. The silence in the room was now heavy, charged. "Every fine you have levied, every threat you have made, has been a complete and utter fabrication. It's not just wrong, it's illegal. It's called slander of title, and it carries significant legal penalties." Brenda stood up, her face turning a blotchy red. "This is a forgery. You forged this. Our lawyers have reviewed the documents." "Have they, Brenda?" I asked, my voice laced with steel. "Or did they just take your word for it? Did you ever actually show them this map?" Or did you just point them in my direction and tell them to attack? I clicked to the next slide. It was the deed of severance from 1998, showing the moment my grandfather legally cut his 2 acres free, long before the HOA ever existed. The paper trail is crystal clear. Anyone who spends 30 minutes at the records office can see it. Which brings up an interesting question: are you incompetent, or are you a liar? How dare you, she shrieked, banging her gavel on the table. This meeting is over. I don't think so, I said, my voice cutting through her rage. Because we haven't gotten to the interesting part yet. We haven't talked about the money. Her face went pale. At the front table, I saw George Maxwell flinch, his eyes wide with terror. He knew what was coming. The trap had sprung. Brenda's reaction was everything I had anticipated, and more. She was a cornered animal, lashing out with pure, undiluted rage. Lies. All of it. He's a con man, trying to get out of paying what he owes. Security, remove this man. The security consisted of 2 elderly men from the neighborhood watch, who looked at me, then at each other, and wisely decided to remain seated. The crowd was buzzing now. The seeds of doubt I had planted were beginning to sprout. People were whispering, looking from the map on the screen to Brenda's unraveling composure. Her social credibility, the currency she traded in, was evaporating before her eyes. You'll be hearing from our lawyer, she screamed at me, her voice cracking. I will sue you for every penny you have. I will ruin you. I believe that's my line, Brenda, I said calmly, turning back to the audience. As I was saying, before I was so rudely interrupted, my lawyer's letter mentioned financial irregularities. Let's talk about those, shall we? This was the moment. Phase 2 was complete. I had revealed the truth about my property, and in doing so, I had revealed her incompetence. Her power was still intact, but her authority was shattered. The residents no longer saw her as a protector of their values, they saw her as a bully who had been publicly proven wrong. I packed up my projector. I had shown them just enough. I hadn't revealed the embezzlement yet. That was my ace in the hole, the final card to be played in Phase 3. I wanted her to squirm. I wanted her to spend the next few days in a state of pure panic, wondering what else I knew. As I walked out of the clubhouse, a few people patted my shoulder. David gave me a wide grin and a thumbs up. The tide was turning. The occupation was beginning to crumble. Brenda, however, was not one to retreat. She was one to double down. If the first rule of holes is to stop digging, Brenda's response was to rent an excavator. Her retaliation was swift and vicious. She couldn't fight me on the facts of the property line anymore, so she decided to try and destroy me as a person. 2 days after the meeting, a new notice appeared on the community bulletin board. It was a public safety alert from the HOA. It warned residents about a disruptive individual in the neighborhood who had shown aggressive and unstable behavior. It didn't use my name, but it used my address. It vaguely hinted at a history of litigation and advised residents to keep their children away from my property, as a precaution. It was a smear campaign, pure and simple. An attempt to paint me as a monster, a predator. The accusation was so vile, so far beyond the pale, that it backfired. The neighbors I had spoken to, the ones who knew about the whimsical welcome mat and the sidewalk chalk fines, saw it for what it was, the desperate act of a tyrant losing her grip. Next, she tried to attack my livelihood. An anonymous complaint was filed with the State Engineering and Surveying Board, accusing me of professional misconduct and ethics violations. It was full of lies, claiming I had falsified documents and performed fraudulent surveys. It was transparently her work, but it still triggered a formal investigation. I had to hire another lawyer, spend hours compiling records from my 40-year career to defend my own professional integrity. It was a costly, stressful nuisance designed to bleed me dry and break my spirit. It didn't work. It just poured more concrete into the foundation of my resolve. The final piece I needed fell into my lap that Friday evening. My phone rang. It was a blocked number. When I answered, a nervous, shaky voice on the other end said, "Mr. Graham. It's George. George Maxwell." "George," I said, my heart rate quickening. "I'm glad you called." "I can't live with this," he whispered, his voice cracking with fear. After that meeting, she went insane. She told me I had to shred all the landscaping invoices. She's trying to cover her tracks. She threatened me, Arthur. She said if I didn't help her, she'd make sure I was the one who took the fall for everything. I told you she would, George, I said gently. What do you have for me? Everything, he said. I've been making copies for the last 2 years. Invoices, bank statements, emails. She's been running a dozen different scams. The landscaping fraud is just the beginning. She's been billing the HOA for consulting fees paid to a shell corporation she owns. She's been using the HOA credit card for vacations, for designer clothes, for spa treatments. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars, Arthur. She's bled this community dry. We met an hour later in a dimly lit coffee shop 10 miles away. George slid a thick file folder across the table. It was a meticulously organized portfolio of Brenda's crimes, complete with highlighted receipts and annotated bank statements. He was a man terrified, but he was also a man who had finally found his courage. He was the whistleblower, and he had just handed me a nuclear bomb. The next morning, I took the entire package, my property records, the videos of her harassment, the evidence from George, and a sworn affidavit from him, and walked into the district attorney's office. I didn't go to some junior prosecutor. I had my lawyer get me a meeting with the head of the Economic Crimes Division. We sat in a sterile conference room for 2 hours. I laid out the entire story, from the first fine to the stolen rose bushes to the hundreds of thousands in embezzled funds. The prosecutor, a sharp woman with tired eyes, listened intently, her expression shifting from skepticism to interest, and finally to a cold, hard anger. When I was finished, she looked at the file George had given me. Mr. Graham, she said slowly, what you have here is not just a civil dispute. This is a textbook case of felony grand larceny, wire fraud, and embezzlement. We will be opening a formal investigation immediately. Phase 3, annihilation, was now in the hands of the state. But I knew there had to be a final, public reckoning. The community needed to see justice done, not just read about it in the paper. I worked with the DA's office. They agreed that a public confrontation would be the best way to secure a potential confession and witness her reaction. I called for a second community meeting. I posted the notices myself. A final presentation on the financial health and legal standing of the Willow Creek Estates HOA, the flyer read. All residents are urged to attend. The truth will be revealed. The night of the final showdown, the clubhouse was even more crowded than before. The atmosphere was electric with tension. This time, I knew there were 2 plainclothes detectives from the DA's office sitting in the back row, looking like bored dads. Brenda was there, of course. She had to be. To not show up would be an admission of guilt. She sat at the front table, flanked by the remnants of her board. She looked haggard, her mask of superiority cracked and peeling. She tried to project an air of defiance, but her eyes betrayed a deep, gnawing fear. I didn't bother with a friendly greeting. I walked straight to the projector and turned it on. Good evening, everyone, I began. I know you all came here for answers, and I promise you, tonight you will get them. We've already established that the HOA has no legal authority over my property. The foreclosure action has been withdrawn, and my lawyers are currently in discussion with the HOA's counsel about the significant damages I am owed for this malicious campaign. I let that hang in the air for a moment. But this was never just about my property. It was about an abuse of power that has affected every single person in this room. It was about what happens when one person's ego is allowed to run unchecked. And it was about your money. I clicked the remote. The first slide was a simple line graph. It showed the HOA's annual dues over the past 5 years, climbing at a rate far steeper than inflation. Have you ever wondered where all your money was going? I asked the crowd. Then I started. One by one, I put George's documents on the screen. The invoice from Miller Landscaping for $10,000 for annual flower planting, next to a supplier receipt showing the actual cost of the flowers was less than $1,000. The video of her foreman stealing the rose bushes, followed by the newsletter notice of the special assessment to replace them. With every slide, a new wave of shock and anger rippled through the room. I showed them the payments to a company called Community Management Solutions, LLC, then I showed them the state registration for that company, listing Brenda Miller as the sole owner. It was a shell corporation she had set up to pay herself tens of thousands of dollars in consulting fees. Then came the credit card statements. $5,000 hotel bills in Hawaii, listed as research for community landscaping, charges from Gucci, from Tiffany's, from high-end restaurants, all paid for with their money. I was calm, methodical. I presented the evidence like I was presenting a final survey report, letting the facts speak for themselves. The room had gone from silent to a low, angry roar. People were shouting, standing up, pointing at Brenda. She sat there, frozen, her face a mask of disbelief and horror. The world she had built, the illusion of her own power and importance, was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, in front of the very people she had lorded it over. "It's all lies," she finally shrieked, finding her voice. "He's a criminal. He's twisting everything. George." She turned to the treasurer, her eyes wild with desperation. "George, tell them. Tell them he's lying." George Maxwell, who had been sitting there trembling, slowly stood up. He looked at Brenda, then at the angry faces of his neighbors. And in that moment, he made a choice. "No, Brenda," he said, his voice surprisingly strong. "He's not lying. It's all true. I have the records. I gave them to him." "I'm so sorry," he said to the room. "I was too afraid to speak up." That was it. The final betrayal. Brenda's whole body seemed to collapse in on itself. But then, the rage took over. She launched herself to her feet, her face contorted into a grotesque mask of fury. "You worm," she screamed at George. "You sniveling little coward. And you." She spun around and pointed a trembling finger at me. "You think you've won? This isn't over. I will destroy you. I will burn your house to the ground." It was in the middle of this unhinged, public threat of arson that the two detectives in the back stood up. They walked calmly, deliberately, through the stunned crowd. "Brenda Miller," one of them said, his voice cutting through her tirade. "You're under arrest for grand larceny, embezzlement, and multiple counts of fraud." The sight of the handcuffs clicking onto her wrists was something no one in that room would ever forget. The color drained from her face, replaced by a slack-jawed, primal terror. The fight went out of her completely. She looked small, pathetic, a deflated balloon of a woman. As they led her out of the clubhouse, past the neighbors she had terrorized for years, she looked over her shoulder at me one last time. Her eyes were filled with a venomous, impotent hatred. "You'll regret this," she hissed. I just stood there, watching her go. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I just felt a profound sense of quiet. The storm had finally passed. The aftermath was swift and decisive. The story was all over the local news. The HOA, leaderless and disgraced, completely imploded. The remaining board members resigned. A court-appointed receiver took over to untangle the financial mess Brenda had left behind. It turned out she had stolen over $400,000 over 6 years. Brenda, facing an avalanche of evidence and testimony from a dozen neighbors I had unwittingly empowered, took a plea deal. She was sentenced to 5 years in state prison. Her house was sold at auction to help pay back the money she had stolen. Every trace of her reign was wiped clean. A new homeowners association was eventually formed, run by a board of genuinely decent people, including David, the man I'd helped with the mulch. Their first official act was to pass a resolution formally acknowledging my property's exemption and issuing a public apology on behalf of the community. Their second act was to dissolve the Architectural Review Committee. People started painting their doors whatever color they wanted. Someone put up a wind chime, and its gentle, atonal sound was the sweetest music I had ever heard. As for me, I finally got the peace I had come for. The lawsuit against the old HOA was settled for a significant sum, more than enough to cover my legal fees and to finally restore my grandfather's house. I hired a crew, and we spent the next few months bringing it back to its former glory. We straightened the chimney, replaced the roof, and gave it a fresh coat of paint, a handsome, dark blue that was definitely not on any approved palette. I became something of a reluctant local hero. People would stop by to thank me. They'd bring pies or bottles of wine. I appreciated the sentiment, but the truth was, I hadn't done it for them. I had done it for me. I had done it for my grandfather's memory, and for Eleanor's. I had fought to protect the one sanctuary I had left. Standing on my newly painted porch one evening, watching the sunset filter through the old oak trees, I thought about the nature of boundaries. Brenda had tried to impose false ones on me, while ignoring the real, legal lines that defined her own world. She had believed her will was enough to bend reality. But reality, like the iron survey monuments buried in the earth, is a stubborn thing. You can ignore it, you can build on top of it, but sooner or later, it will reassert itself. My life had been defined by lines, by the clear-cut certainty of a surveyor's map. Grief had erased all those lines, leaving me lost in an undefined wilderness. In a strange way, Brenda's war had given me a new map. It had given me a problem to solve, a boundary to defend. In fighting for my home, I had, in a way, found my way back to myself. The porch swing groaned its familiar, comforting tune. The air was cool and quiet. My grandfather's old truck still sat by the garage, a proud, rusty monument to a time before beige conformity. It was finally silent. Not the loud, empty silence of my old apartment, but a deep, peaceful quiet. The kind of quiet that feels like coming home. I had fought a war I never wanted, but the peace I had won was worth every battle.